Adapting a video game is hard. Like, notoriously hard. A big part of the reason why is that video game narratives are kind of unique. The narrative structure of a typical novel is a lot easier to map onto the narrative structure that works for film than video games, because a novel is still a linear narrative that generally hits the same beats. A novel also isn't a visual medium, which means that anyone adapting it into a visual medium like film has the advantage of some creative liberty to accommodate changes involved in that adaptation. Like, we might know how a character's been described or the general vibe of a setting, but a filmmaker gets to decide what it'll look like when it's not left to a narrator to describe. Games, in comparison, are kind of the worst of both worlds. There's a lot less creative freedom left up to a filmmaker making a video game adaptation because visuals will already have been established, and the narrative is often far less linear on a structural level, as well as being frequently way more individualized. However, the big thing is that games are obviously interactive. Even a linear story with room for creative interpretation still has gameplay mechanics that aren't easy to adapt to a non-interactive medium. Like, okay, everyone who reads The Hunger Games knows that Rue will be killed by Marvel, then Katniss will kill Marvel, and then Katniss does her three-finger salute thing. That event happened for everyone who read the books in that order at that same point. When you're making a movie about it, you can do that. You can just keep that in that order happening in that same way. But if you're trying to make an adaptation of a game like Life is Strange, you have to make some definitive decisions. Not every player will experience every event, or maybe will experience the same event but not in the same way, or at the same point in time, or with the same relationships developed already. And as a filmmaker, you would be tasked with defining which events are or aren't canonical in this version of the story. A video game can exist where different players experience different versions of the same narrative. You can choose to save Arcadia Bay and be wrong, or you can choose to save Chloe, and that's your choice. But if a movie was made about Life is Strange, you'd have to decide which narrative is the definitive narrative of Life is Strange the movie. And you'd have to find a way to get someone as invested in a character on the big screen making that decision as they were when they had to press the button themselves. Same goes for television. The Last of Us, in the grand scheme of things, is still a pretty linear video game narrative, but the TV show has to decide which moments make the cut and how characters definitively behaved. Not how you behaved when you were in Joel's shoes. It also had to remove a lot of the violence, because while it was necessary for the video game in terms of how it was meant to be experienced, it would quickly come across as excessive in a TV series where each clicker is just a clicker, not a lot of little skill tests that could end your run if you screwed up. This gets even harder for a game without a singular definitive story. An open world game is hard to adapt because there's not even a concrete defined player character a lot of the time. Like, if you made a movie about Skyrim's story, you'd have to make a lot of decisions that'll make your version of that story unrecognizable to a lot of people. Same goes for something like a sandbox game like Minecraft. If you try and adapt it, you will inevitably have to try and tell a story about a world that, kind of by design, doesn't have a comprehensive definitive narrative, where you're both audience and author of your own story. So, how do you do it? How do you tell a story about a game without a definitive story? To answer that question, I want to look beyond the world of video game adaptations and instead discuss the 1985 movie Clue. Based on an adaptation of the board game of the same name, the movie demonstrates a really solid, successful approach to adapting a game without a story into a more traditional narrative structure, and maybe provide some insights into what can make game adaptations work. Before we start, a quick channel update. This video was chosen by my channel members in May, but due to issues with creating a version of this video that Paramount doesn't copyright claim to death, I've had to rework it a few times and delay its release. The game that you'll be hopefully seeing in the background of a lot of this video is a Clue PC game that I originally got in a box of cereal in the early 2000s because showing bits of the movie didn't go over so well. It's also being released simultaneously with the June Members' Choice video, Overwatch 2's weird relationship with representation, which was picked by members for this month. It's a 2-for-1 day on the channel, so I hope you enjoy. Speaking of the Members' Choice videos, here are the 4 July topics that'll be up for members. The first is the missing link in competitive Overwatch, a returning topic from May covering what I consider to be the fundamental flaw with the Overwatch League, its original sin, if you will, that follows up on the work done in my past videos about contenders and collegiate. The second topic is Spike Chunsoft and the right way to tell an unhinged story, a semi-new topic exploring the successes and failures of Spike Chunsoft to tell some truly unhinged stories and still keep them coherent and engaging. This is a rework of the old topic 999 Made Me Hate the Titanic and Telepathy, since that topic managed to lose 4 consecutive polls. Next, we've got how Overwatch's cosmetics create a culture of classism, a brand new topic about how cosmetics in Overwatch 2 not only play on feelings of FOMO, but also create a culture of haves and have-nots. And lastly, we've got the philosophies of Overwatch's heroes, a brand new topic looking at the actual philosophies of the Overwatch roster and seeing what it tells us about the universe of Overwatch. If you'd like to vote in the Members' Choice poll, it'll be going live on July 1st and will run for 10 full days, with the winning topic coming out on or around July 21st. You can get a monthly membership and vote in the poll for $5 by clicking the join button below, and your support really helps the channel. Anyways, let's get into it, starting with Part 1. What is Clue? Now, I'm going to be summarizing the Clue movie for you here, obviously, and I'm warning you in advance there are going to be spoilers. If you haven't seen this movie before, I recommend watching it first, but honestly, it's a ridiculously rewatchable movie, and knowing how it ends doesn't take away from that. So if you haven't seen it, this video won't ruin the experience for you, at least not in my opinion. I also want to emphasize, I am like an obsessive Clue fan. Like, I need to kind of lay out my credentials here. Like, I love the board game and I own a very fancy version of it. I got the movie on DVD as a gift and have also paid for it through YouTube. Like, I bought a digital version of it. And I've also been given a whole bunch of Clue related gifts over the years, including this shadow box that my mom made me because she's amazing. Is any of this relevant? Maybe, maybe not, but I wanted to show off the shadow box and also hype up my mom, so it's going in anyways. The board game Clue, or Cluedo if you live in hell, is a murder mystery game. A mysterious Mr. Body has been found dead in his mansion, and you need to figure out who did it, with what weapon, in what room. Players are given a series of evidence cards indicating who didn't do it before taking control of one of 6 guests: Miss Scarlet, Colonel Mustard, Mrs. White, Mr. Green, Mrs. Peacock, or Professor Plum, and explore the manor by rolling dice, making suggestions in each room until they've narrowed down the options enough to make an accusation. Different versions of the game sometimes have different characters, rooms, or weapons, such as the more recent versions having Dr. Orchid in place of Mrs. White, but that's the gist of it. There's no real defined narrative beyond beginning with Mr. Body was murdered and one of you did it, and ending with the randomly determined guilty party either being sent to prison or getting away with it. The movie keeps this fundamental structure. Miss Scarlet, Colonel Mustard, Mrs. White, Mr. Green, Mrs. Peacock, and Professor Plum are all present at Mr. Body's mansion when he dies, and need to identify which one of them killed him, which weapon they used, and which room it happened in. At the end of the movie, the guilty party will be identified and arrested. For this adaptation, it's primarily focused on expanding the premise into a real narrative. Like, for example, why are the 6 guests at the manor? In the board game, it's usually just for a party, but in the movie, each of the 6 main characters are being blackmailed by Mr. Body, and have been invited to the manor by an unknown person who promises to help bring an end to that blackmail. Upon all the guests being assembled, they're each given one of the 6 iconic weapons by Body, who tells them to kill Wadsworth, the butler, played by Tim Curry, when he turns off the lights to keep their secrets safe.
The only way to avoid finding yourselves on the front pages is for one of you to kill Wadsworth. Now.
Unsurprisingly, when the lights come back on, it turns out somebody's actually killed Mr. Body instead, and the hunt is on to figure out who did it and how. Speaking of Wadsworth, a major change is the addition of extra characters. Wadsworth is revealed to be Mr. Body's former butler, and had sent the letters to the other guests, hoping to be able to expose Mr. Body as revenge for blackmailing him and his wife about her friendships with socialists. For context, this movie takes place literally during the McCarthy trials, so when she refused to give them up, Body decided to blackmail the pair into slavery, with Wadsworth's wife eventually taking her own life over it. With each of the other guests, Body viewed them as thoroughly un-American for one reason or another, and like a good capitalist, decided to use his knowledge to make a little extra cash rather than just turning them over to the authorities. Alongside Wadsworth, there's the definitely French maid of vet, a cook, a motorist, a cop, and a singing telegram girl. Each of them, aside from obviously Wadsworth, is one of Mr. Body's informants, and all of them, again, aside from Wadsworth, are killed over the course of the movie by guests trying to cover up their secrets. Speaking of the guests and their secrets, let's go through them quickly in the order that they play in the game. Starting with Scarlet, she runs a brothel in Washington, D.C., and the informant related to her was the cop who had told Body about her operation. Mustard stole Air Force radio parts and sold them on the black market. The motorist had been his driver during World War II and had leaked that information to Body. Mrs. White is a black widow who's had at least 5 husbands of her own, no speaking about how many she's had from other women, all of whom have mysteriously disappeared. The most recent one was killed after White found out she'd been having an affair with a vet, who was also one of Scarlet's employees, who had told Body about it. Green is a homosexual who works for the State Department and would lose his job if he was outed. Nobody is revealed to have explicitly informed on him, so either Body found it out himself, or his informant just wasn't present. Peacock's husband is a US senator, and she accepts bribes on his behalf from special interests and foreign powers for his vote on certain committees. The cook used to be her cook, and Body got that information from her. Finally, Plum previously worked as a psychiatrist before losing his license over his inappropriate affairs with his clients. The singing telegram girl had been one of his patients and had informed on him to Body. In the logic of the movie, a weapon can only be used successfully once. Only the main roster of 6 can ultimately be the guilty party, and a murder can only happen in one of the 9 named rooms. After Body is thought to have been killed in the study, he's found to have been killed again in the hall with the candlestick. But there's no way to know who did it. Or is there? A fun thing about the Clue movie is that Clue has 3 separate endings with 3 different killers, or I guess like 9 killers ultimately, but that's neither here nor there. It creates a really interesting Schrodinger's cat situation regardless. If you've been joining me for Virtue's Last Reward over on Twitch, you're very familiar with this stuff already. Otherwise, you've probably heard about it in one of the billion places it's referenced. This isn't like a super obscure thing. But for those who aren't familiar, Schrodinger's cat refers to an experiment where a cat is placed in a box with a piece of radioactive material and a vial of poisonous gas that, if struck by a radioactive particle, will break, releasing the gas and killing the cat. Over an hour, there's an exactly 50-50 chance of the vial being broken, and the box is completely soundproofed. There's no way to know if the cat is alive or dead without opening the box and checking, so the cat is considered to be in what's called a quantum superposition, meaning it exists in multiple states simultaneously until measured. The cat in the box is both alive and dead until the box is opened, at which point one of the two states is defined as truth. Now, I don't think it's intentional, but Clue is actually a really fun example of Schrodinger's cat, kind of, in its own way. Mr. Body, the cook, the motorist, Yvette, the cop, and the singing telegram girl are all killed prior to the movie's divergence point, which happens after Wadsworth reenacts all the killings and then turns off the lights.
It's been up again, and the motorist switched off the electricity. Oh my God!
Not again. Turn on the lights!
Before the light is turned off, the story and its characters exist in a quantum superposition of A, B, C. But after the light is turned on, the measurement is taken, and the story is either ending in A, B, or C. In A, Scarlett is ultimately the killer and used Yvette as a tool to commit some of the murders. She's the Peko Pekoyama of this story, and Yvette was the killer for both Body and the cook. Scarlett killed the motorist when Mustard left her alone in the ballroom after Yvette told her about the secret passageways, and then killed Yvette, the cop, and the singing telegram girl herself. She reveals she did it all because she wanted to basically take over from Body, but instead of money, she wants the others to pay the blackmail and government information. She's thwarted by Wadsworth, who reveals he's been working with the police all along. In this ending, Scarlett, through Yvette, killed Body in the hall with the candlestick. In B, Peacock killed everybody once she realized what was happening to try and hide her secrets. It's honestly a very boring ending. I don't think there's anyone who, genuinely prefers this one over the other two, but she is similarly thwarted to Scarlett. In this ending, Peacock killed Body in the hall with the candlestick. In C, it gets complicated. Plum killed Body with the candlestick in the hall, Peacock killed the cook with the knife in the kitchen, Mustard killed the motorist in the lounge with the wrench, White killed Yvette in the billiard room with the rope, Scarlett killed the cop with the lead pipe in the library, and Wadsworth was the one who killed the singing telegram girl with the revolver in the hall. Turns out, in this ending, Wadsworth was actually the real Mr. Body, and the man that Plum killed was just Soul Butler. Body reveals the whole scheme was just about getting his victims to dispose of his informants and create even more blackmail material, but then Green reveals that he's actually a secret FBI agent, pulls out a gun, and takes out Body himself. In this ending, Green killed Body with the revolver in the hall, and also is a straight man.
They all did it! But if you want to know who killed Mr. Body, I did. In the hall, with the revolver. Okay, Chief, take him away. I'm gonna go home and sleep with my wife.
Can't believe the FBI was queerbaiting for clout. We really do live in a society. It's fun to think about all of this because it means that until the lights turn on at the end of the movie, Scarlett, Peacock, and White all killed Yvette, and the act of turning on the light and observing it is what absolves two of them of the crime. Mr. Green is either a straight secret FBI agent or a gay State Department employee, and both are treated as simultaneously true throughout the entire movie until the end. The man that is Body in the first two endings is killed by Plum in the third ending, but in that ending, he's not Mr. Body. So, did Plum ever kill Body? In the other timelines, that man remains Body, but if Plum kills him, then he becomes the butler and Wadsworth becomes Body. And it's not like this is just a cheap plot twist at the end or whatever that doesn't really make sense. If you pay close enough attention, each conclusion is a viable one. Characters sneak away from the group at the exact right moments to make each outcome plausible, so even though the movie says that C is the true ending, or the truest one, there's nothing ultimately more true about it than the others. Each timeline is theoretically plausible, mostly. Now, all of this is, severely glossing over the movie. It's absolutely hilarious. Again, you really should watch it yourself, and the only reason I'm not just, showing you a compilation of all the best moments is because I tried that already, kind of, and YouTube copyright claims that shit to death. However, hopefully by now you understand what Clue is, and we can talk about what it tells us about storytelling. Part 2. Characters are hard. It's hard to write compelling characters. We've talked about character design before on this channel, so I'll avoid repeating myself too much while we focus on specifically how to take a blank slate character and give them an identity that people actually like, that works for people. In the board games, the 6 guests don't really have a personality beyond what might be communicated by their faces in their character cards, or in the game's box art. Okay, literally the only thing that we reliably know about Miss Scarlet when it comes to the Clue games is that her name is Scarlet and her dress is red. And the movie doesn't even keep the dress, so it's just her name. On top of that, it's not just an issue of people not knowing who Scarlet is. In a lot of video game adaptations, you can kind of cope with a blank slate protagonist being adapted by relying on other characters who do have more defined personalities and relationships and dynamics with that character. Like, even if Agent 47 is a blank slate, his dynamic with Diana gives you something to build off of. However, with Clue, you're left with just the 6 blank slate characters from the board game: Scarlet, Mustard, White, Green, Peacock, and Plum. The big challenge for Clue is that all 6 characters need to be turned into fully realized personalities with nothing to build off of, especially since the board game generally presents all 6 of them as being strangers, so there's not really an option of being like, oh yeah, all these people are co-workers at this place, they all know each other because of XYZ, that's both of their backstories out of the way at once. The guests in the movie sometimes know of one another, but they've never met before arriving at Hill House. So how do you get around that? Well, for one, you build it into the premise. Clue needed to explain why the guests were at the manor, why they used color-coded names, why they're all strangers, why all 6 of them have an equal motive for killing Body, and develop personalities and backstories for all 6 of them right out of the gate. And it's able to handle all of that remarkably efficiently by establishing that Body is blackmailing them for, as the movie describes it, being thoroughly un-American. Scarlet's a madam, Mustard's a war profiteer, White's a black widow, Green's gay, Peacock's involved in crooked politics, and Plum had inappropriate relationships with his female patients. Not really, fair and balanced, but sure, why not? The characters use the names they've been given because they're pseudonyms. Wadsworth decided they'd all benefit from having a fake name, and nobody questions that because it's true, they do all benefit from some anonymity. The fact they're all being blackmailed over things that would ruin their lives if they were exposed explains why nobody wants to call the cops. And the characters use the threat of collectively pinning the whole thing on anyone who tries to leave to explain why they all stick around, rather than fleeing the scene of the crime. Early in the movie, Wadsworth sits everyone down in the study and goes through the cast one by one explaining what they're being blackmailed for, not only doing exposition, but also giving the characters a chance to establish their personalities. Some guests, like Peacock, not only deny the accusation, but also express disgust at other guests for their indiscretions, while others, like Scarlet, are not ashamed in the slightest to admit why they're being blackmailed. Green has to kind of build up the courage to admit what's going on with him, while Mustard tries to divert attention away from the actual issue at hand. White presents her alibi for her husband's deaths in a way that's just very clearly been rehearsed. After all, she's been through this before, and Plum just sits there fuming while puffing his pipe through all of his accusations. He's already lost his license over it, and so to him, it's kind of just like something frustrating from his past that people won't let go of. This movie also really doesn't waste time. If a character is introduced, it's for a reason. Wadsworth functions as a bit of a game master or narrator for the group, while Yvette gives the roster someone to bounce off of who's also allowed to be disposable while establishing the importance of secondary characters. The cook, motorist, cop, and singing telegram girl all exist to ensure that main characters have a general motive to kill, as well as establishing the extent of Body's blackmail and increasing the tension of the narrative. Each death is a key part of the puzzle at the end of the movie when Wadsworth reveals who killed each of the victims, how, and with what, since it narrows down which guests had the opportunity to become a killer. And ultimately, the guilty party of each ending is revealed to be the guest who is found to be hiding the revolver in their pocket or purse. The main cast, which is, the guests plus Yvette and Wadsworth, all get pretty even screen time, while the secondary roster are given exactly as much time as necessary to fulfill their narrative purpose and not a second longer. And in some cases, that's very literal. Like, okay, the singing telegram girl is killed about 6 seconds after making her first appearance, and the motorist is killed less than 2 seconds after revealing to the audience that one of the guests is his former boss, right before he's able to say where he worked for them. Characters are always a challenge when it comes to adapting a narrative from a game, whether it's a board game or a video game, because it's not always easy to establish who the characters even are, or which ones are important. Clue benefits from having established characters, at least in name if not in personality, but if you're familiar with board game movies, you might remember that they also tried to make a Battleship movie in 2012, a movie primarily notable for being bad and also featuring Rihanna. Battleship doesn't have any characters to start with, which obviously makes this whole process a lot harder. When it comes to video game adaptations, there's also an added challenge. Namely, the things that make a good video game protagonist when you're in their shoes often don't make for a good movie or TV show protagonist. Like, Link is a great protagonist in terms of being the strong silent type for the game he's in, but a Tears of the Kingdom movie probably can't just spend 2 hours following him around as he silently chops down trees and straps rockets to Koroks. It's a lot of fun when you're playing the game, when you're Link, but not so much when you're a spectator to a scripted event. On the flip side, you have games with a lot of very established characters like Overwatch or League, and this kind of creates the opposite problem. Who's going to be your main character? Which characters are even allowed to be included in the narrative to begin with? Clue is already really pushing it with a main cast of like 6 at the core, but 8 in reality, and the movie is adamant that nobody is the main character. The casts are usually kept together and they trade lines, and when they split up, there's a lot of attention paid to making sure that all of them are getting pretty even screen time. We can see how League handles this when it came to Arcane. Namely, it didn't try to include everyone. It picked a few characters to talk about and one character's story to really tell in depth, and just left the others out. Overwatch is especially challenging because even though it has well-defined character personalities and a lot of established relationships, the whole story revolves around the gang getting back together.
Monsieur, does this mean Overwatch is back?
Yes. Yes, we are.
By definition, if you want to move the main plot of the narrative forward, you can't really split them up and tell individual stories in the same way you could have with League. However, you also can't really take the Clue approach and try and make an ensemble story out of them because they all have a lot more going on than the Clue characters did, and it's necessary to explain a lot more to understand the state of things. That actually ties into the next point I want to make, which is Part 3, A Manageable Universe. Clue is a standalone story, in the sense that you don't need to consume any other media to understand it, it doesn't build off of any other stories, whatever, and it benefits from having a very small universe. It's really easy to cover all the bases in terms of who these people are outside of Hill House, why they're at the mansion, and what events led to the events in the movie. A big challenge of adaptations, regardless of the source material, is finding a way to either condense or stretch the existing universe to work with the medium you're looking at. Like when a book gets adapted into a movie, there's always at least something that gets cut because books are just much longer than movies. You need to cut something for time. And remember, books, as mentioned earlier, are a much friendlier medium from a structural standpoint for a film or television adaptation compared to a video game. Video games often have a lot of fluff content that's meant to fill out their world, and if you're turning a 40-hour video game into a 2-hour movie, some of that shit is gonna have to be cut. But the problem is that a lot of that ties into what people actually like about the game. Like, okay, if you like Skyrim, you might like the main story, but you also probably like at least some of the side stories. And if you wanted to try and adapt the story in a direct one-to-one way, most of that's going to get cut out. The Dragonborn of Skyrim the movie probably isn't going to canonically be the Listener of the Dark Brotherhood, and Guildmaster of the Thieves Guild, and Harbinger of the Companions, and Archmage of the College of Winterhold, and Thane of all Nine Holds. If you try and adapt the Dragonborn story to any other medium, you'll have to make some cuts somewhere that'll make their story entirely distinct from the way that the players experienced it, and you'll inevitably lose elements of the world that those people enjoyed. This is why a lot of video game adaptations that have been successful are more along the lines of the set in the universe of stories, you know, rather than just trying to retell the story of the game when it doesn't have a definitive story. A solid example of this is obviously Edgerunners, which didn't try to retell the game's story, but instead told a new one that still built upon the themes of Cyberpunk 2077 without having to try to fit a video game narrative into a TV show-sized whole. Cyberpunk 2077, as experienced by V, is the kind of massive world that you'd never be able to comprehensively fit into a single linear narrative because it isn't built to be experienced as one. But by telling David's story instead, you still get to tell a Cyberpunk story without having to worry about trying to make a single V narrative that every V can identify with. This is especially difficult because we live in an era where it feels like everything has to be an expanded universe, and the problem with that is it's really hard to tell those stories well. Like, sure, Marvel can do it because they've got infinite money and literal generations of source material to build out from, but starting a brand new expanded universe is hard, even when it's relatively minor. Overwatch has kind of tried to do expanded universe stuff through, like, you know, its comics and its cinematic shorts and all that, like it technically counts maybe. But again, a big part of the reason why the narrative struggles to move forward is that it's really hard to bring all that together in a cohesive way. It's honestly kind of remarkable that Marvel's had as much success with this as they have. DC's attempts have struggled to get off the ground for years, and Universal's Dark Universe? I mean, did you even remember that that one existed? By keeping the universe of Clue concise and limited in terms of size, it becomes way, way more workable as an adaptation. You don't need to explain the backstory on Mrs. White's husbands, or how Colonel Mustard handled the war, or how Yvette came to be working for Miss Scarlet, or how Mr. Body built this network of informants. Part of why Clue succeeds as an adaptation is that it's built to expand the universe only as much as is necessary and no further. It tells you exactly as much as you need to know about the broader universe and stops there. And that's really hard to do. Even with Edgerunners, which I think largely succeeds at this, there are still moments where somebody who hasn't played the game will hit a wall because they haven't spent 20 hours running around Night City learning how this universe works. And that's not to say that the creators of Edgerunners are worse than the creators of Clue. Edgerunners is great. Like, I really liked it. A lot of people did. Obviously, like, this wasn't a bad adaptation. Edgerunners is starting out just from a much less favorable position as an adaptation because it is so different from our world. And the further a narrative universe is from our reality, the more time has to be dedicated to explaining those things to an audience. Clue takes place in our real world at one point in time. Like, these are all people who could theoretically exist, governed by a reality that we also live under and can identify. The movie sets the time and place very clearly at the start and relies on your understanding of what that time and place would mean. This is happening in the US during the Red Scare, literally during the McCarthy Army trials, which is why Wadsworth is able to be blackmailed over his wife being friends with socialists, and why Green can be blackmailed over just being gay and working for the government. If you look deeper at the movie, you can also see the time and place being expressed in more subtle ways. Like, okay, the cook is a Chinese woman named Mrs. Ho who prepares traditional Cantonese cuisine and can be seen watching those McCarthy trials at the beginning, and works with Body to expose the anti-American Mrs. Peacock. Combining that with the knowledge that this movie is set in 1954 might tell you a thing or two about what motivated her to work with him. Same goes for the cop in a different way as a black police officer in Washington, D.C. While most of the secondary characters in Clue are relatively powerless people in the grand scheme of things, you've got a cook, a chauffeur, a prostitute, and a sane telegram girl, a police officer is in a position with significantly more power than all of them. However, by making him a black cop in Washington, D.C. in 1954, a time when the D.C. police were still doing segregated assignments, it brings a different dynamic to not only the character himself, but also the relationship he has with both Scarlet and Body. A lot of these details are pretty easy to miss, partially because Clue is a very dense movie, but also partially because it can afford for you to miss some of them. Like, you don't need to notice that the cook is a Chinese woman watching the Army McCarthy trials to still be able to identify the reality these characters live in, especially if you were watching the movie when it first came out in 1985. For Edgerunners, you need to do a lot more work to make sure your audience is up to speed on the rules of the universe in terms of the economic, political, cultural, social, and technological state of things, how they interlock, and how they relate to the characters. And again, Edgerunners genuinely does a really good job of explaining it without just sitting you down for 3 days of exposition. Seeing David struggling at a fancy rich kid's school, his mom's death, the lack of supports that exist for him, and the lack of consideration for what happened to her all help to establish pretty early on what kind of a universe this is. To bring it back to Overwatch again, it would be especially hard to do that, because you not only need to explain the Omnics, which, as I've already talked about for way too long on this channel, is a complete nightmare, but also Overwatch as an organization, as well as the people who are involved in it. You need to establish the nature of modern technology in Overwatch's universe in terms of things like hard light and healing, and explain how the Omnic crisis specifically affected some countries to explain why, Mexico produced Sombra while South Korea produced Diva. You need to explain why the world was okay with creating this, license to kill free-reign paramilitary group, then why it fell apart, why it's getting back together, what happened in Australia, Korea, Russia, America, Canada, the UK, and Numbani. Hell, you need to explain what Numbani is to begin with. Game universes are also just often pretty massive, because they're largely built in a way that allows players to explore and experience them in their own ways at their own time, and you don't have the luxury of doing that with a film or TV adaptation. Clue, as a board game, benefits from starting from a relatively small universe and being able to expand it as necessary, rather than starting from a huge universe and needing to make cuts until it becomes manageable. However, this video is already getting pretty long, and there's still one more thing I want to talk about, so we're going to move on from that and go on to Part 4, the mechanics. This is probably the most challenging thing to translate from any sort of an adaptation to any other medium. There aren't, mechanics of reading a book that you need to find a way to interpret when it comes to turning it into a TV show. But obviously, games have gameplay mechanics, whether that's a board game, card game, tabletop role-playing game, or video game. And trying to find a way to translate that into a medium that doesn't have a level of interactability is the kind of thing that can make an adaptation hard, because mechanics are often inseparable from the narrative. In Clue, the board game, there are 6 character cards, 6 weapon cards, and 9 room cards. One card from each set is selected at random and hidden in an envelope at the start of the game to identify who the killer is, what weapon they used, and what room it happened in, with the remaining cards being handed out to the other players. Those cards then function as evidence that various rooms, weapons, and people weren't involved in Body's death, and players take turns rolling a die to enter rooms and making guesses, so that other players have to disprove them if they can. If Miss Scarlet guesses that it was Mustard in the lounge with the revolver, and the person playing Mustard has all 3 of those cards, they can pick one to show Scarlet to disprove that suggestion. If somebody makes a guess that nobody can disprove, then that means they've likely found the combination of cards that are in the envelope, and from there can make an accusation. If they're right, the game is over and they win. If they're wrong, then they're out of the game and the rest of the players continue. Now, for a movie, you gotta scrap a lot of that. There's no turns, guests don't have clue cards, nobody's making suggestions versus accusations, and there are more murders. Clue makes it work by adapting the core premise of the game into a more standard murder mystery narrative, similar to And Then There Were None, and turns the challenges posed by adapting Clue's gameplay mechanics into a narrative advantage. A major challenge of murder mysteries in general is that it can be really hard to make them both solvable and plausible for the audience in a way that's still narratively satisfying without being just, like, incredibly obvious. But Clue benefits from the fact that the average audience member will know going into it that, in Clue, the solution has to be composed of one of these 6 people with one of these 6 weapons in one of these 9 rooms. Secondary characters can be introduced without the movie really needing to waste time clarifying that they can't be the true killers and can keep the attention on the main cast. Like, even when Yvette is a killer in the Scarlet ending, it's still always framed as Scarlet using Yvette as a tool, rather than Yvette being treated as a killer by the narrative herself, like in her own right. The movie doesn't have to try and find a way to justify why there's only one knife that could have been used to kill somebody in a mansion with a fully stocked kitchen, or why the guests have been given such a strange assortment of deadly weapons. We know we're watching a Clue adaptation, and in the game, these are just the only weapons available. Again, Clue kinda gets to have its cake and eat it too as an adaptation. Its mechanics can actually really help to improve its adaptability, which isn't something you can say for a lot of interactive media. Battleship is a really obvious example of this. The gameplay mechanics of Battleship can't really be adapted in a way that helps tell the story, since the gameplay doesn't really lend itself to another medium in a way that would be usable or useful. On top of that, gameplay in a lot of games isn't exclusively based on what's most realistic or even narratively consistent. It's also based on balance and enjoyability and the experience of playing a video game. It's why the concept of ludonarrative dissonance even exists. Games aren't just telling a story, but are also being interacted with by players, and the fact that a video game needs to be played rather than just watched or read about, whatever, even if somebody else is playing it, affects how we experience them. Taking away that interactability means that a ludonarrative needs to become just a narrative. And given how much games obviously rely on the act of playing them as part of their storytelling, it creates a lot of challenges. Knowing that my audience is like primarily here for Overwatch content, I get it. This might be easier to explain if we look at that context. In Overwatch, ultimates require you to deal damage or heal people in order to charge them up, but that's not like a part of the actual mechanics of the universe of Overwatch. Sombra's EMP doesn't require her to shoot X number of bad guys X number of times in the narrative before she can use it. But in-game, you need to have a mechanic that imposes restrictions and tangible limitations on how abilities can be used, or become unplayable instantly. Looking at Sombra even more, her hack functions entirely differently in-game than in the narrative. In the infiltration short, she can hack environmentals like security systems or infrastructure, but in-game, none of that really exists. Health packs are something that are littered throughout Overwatch maps, but they aren't really there in the narrative. They're just gameplay mechanics that exclusively exist in-game to serve a gameplay purpose. Anyways, if you wanted to make an adaptation of Overwatch, you would need to decide what the actual narrative limitations of everyone's abilities definitively are. Like, can Mercy genuinely resurrect the dead? If so, how often, and what are the requirements? Which hardlight structures can Symmetra or Lifeweaver construct, and what are the characteristics of those structures? In-game, Widowmaker's damage begins to fall off at 50 meters after the most recent patch. In-universe, though, will Cassidy die if he's shot in the skull by one of her fully charged rifle shots at 60 meters? Because in-game, he won't. But obviously, in the narrative, she's a sniper. That would be kind of dumb. You have a lot of heroes with abilities and, numbers, statistics, health, whatever, that makes sense as gameplay mechanics, but would introduce all kinds of challenges to any sort of a narrative you're trying to tell. And just like with any story where you have superpowered characters, it's really easy to make a narrative unsatisfying when you have people who are too powerful for there to be real stakes. If Mercy can resurrect people in the narrative as easily as she can in-game, death itself is no longer even, not just not a major concern, but not a concern at all for the characters on her side, provided they can space out their deaths by at least 30 seconds. When we're talking about most game adaptations and how they'll handle the game's mechanics, we're usually talking about video games with existing narratives and characters and all those sort of things that have to be juggled alongside the mechanics. However, this video is talking about how to handle an adaptation of something where all you've really got is mechanics and a premise where there isn't an established narrative to build out from. One hand, you have games like Battleship, where the mechanics aren't really conducive to an adaptation, but on the other, you have games like Clue, where the mechanics can actually help. On a third, more confusing hand, you also have something like Dungeons & Dragons, where there isn't a defined story, but the game's mechanics are built around being used as storytelling mechanics, just in an interactive way between, players and dungeon masters. However, just like with any other game, you still have to reckon with the fact that those mechanics, even when designed with their role as storytelling tools in mind, are still ultimately built to be gameplay mechanics, relying on the unique aspects of the medium of tabletop role-playing games. If your D&D TV adaptation tries to implement hit points and experience and ability scores and 50 foot of hempen rope, it's probably not going to have the same effect as when they're TTRPG mechanics. Transferring mechanics into an adaptation isn't impossible or anything, but just like with everything else we've talked about, explaining how your gameplay mechanics will manifest in the adaptation takes time. Clue's adaptation is able to use its gameplay mechanics to support the new narrative, while Battleship's adaptation isn't really able to do the same. A game like D&D has a lot of mechanics built around being tools for players to use for storytelling, but specifically in an interactive medium. Translating that to a non-interactive medium complicates things substantially and will require deviating from them pretty significantly. A game like Overwatch also has a lot of gameplay mechanics, but unlike D&D, they are exclusively gameplay mechanics. They're built around how they will manifest in the game. They manifest entirely differently in the narrative, and that creates complications both in terms of having to define their narrative functions and in terms of having to communicate the differences to an audience. In the intro, I said that this video is about answering the question, how do you tell a story about a game without a definitive story? But in reality, this video is more about explaining why it's so hard to do so. Clue is a really successful attempt at doing this in my opinion, but it's important to recognize that there's a lot more to adapting a game to another medium than just making sure to check the right boxes. Some games are well suited to being adapted to other media, while others just aren't. It's not like Clue succeeded where Battleship didn't just because the Clue writers knew some secret that the Battleship writers didn't or something. The takeaway from this video is less like, here are the steps for doing a good adaptation of a game, and more, here's why not every game is suited for being an adaptation into another medium. Some games are better left as games. Like, I don't think we really need a Tears of the Kingdom movie because frankly, without the gameplay and interactable elements, it wouldn't really be Tears of the Kingdom. Other games like Overwatch might be well suited to an adaptation, but would face real challenges to make it work. TV shows like Arcane prove that it's possible, but again, not necessarily easy. Still, other games like Cyberpunk 2077 are probably best suited to adaptations like Edgerunners that try to disengage from the narrative of the game itself and instead focus on exploring and expanding upon the universe of the game world in a different story. In all of this though, there are also some like Clue that prove that not only can adaptations of interactive media be really good, but that they can come from pretty unexpected places. There are unique inherent challenges involved in adapting any sort of interactive media into a non-interactive medium, and while Clue succeeds, at least in my opinion and the opinion of the rest of us in the cult, it should be seen as an example of how hard it can be to check all the boxes for being a good candidate for adaptation, rather than a checklist for the things you can do to just make any game a successful adaptation. Anyways, I think I've ranted about this movie for long enough, so that's where this video is going to end. Thank you very much for watching, and be sure to check out the other video that came out today too, Overwatch 2's weird relationship with representation. That video will be popping up on the screen in just a moment, but is also going to show up with a card in the top right of your screen if you don't want to wait. If you have already seen that video though, I'd recommend also checking out Quantum Redshift and the Games That Lose, a video from a couple weeks back about Microsoft's excellent wipeout killer that was sabotaged by corporate interference, which will also be showing up in a card and in the end screen. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Also, starting on July 1st, channel members will be voting between these 4 topics as the next Members' Choice video. If you'd like to have a say in the future content of this channel, you can grab a $5 membership to make yourself eligible to cast a vote as well. Alternatively, stop by a live stream sometime and you might just get lucky enough to be gifted one. Thank you to all my channel members as well. Insert name here, Mini Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Surtur Z, The Afro of Doom, Endballs, Waron, Gavost, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Indy D, Destiny, Remy, Vamplin, Popsnack, Lenny, Connor, Circo, Damp Weasel, Nature Big Fan, Yoshi of the Wire, and Peggy, Cat Lover 192, Windex the Great, Hermano, Sourdough, Connor M, Wisdom, Hibby, Canera, Marsh Alice, Burfy Chan, and Stickman 34. For anyone who's still watching, as well as my members, thank you again, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.